All right, welcome in, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, a powerful first-hand account of the Soviet prison camp system.
Yeah, it's really intense.
Definitely. But getting into it, we're aiming to understand more deeply what this system was and how it impacted millions.
And its lessons, too, for all of us today.
Exactly. And one thing that really jumped out at me was Solzhenitsyn's point about utopias, those visions of a perfect society. He says they can sometimes demand a horrifying price.
Yeah, and he connects that to materialist utopias, those focus on material equality. He suggests they can end up justifying sacrificing individuals for some greater good.
So then, was creating a utopia ever the real goal? Or was it always about power, with the horror itself being the objective?
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
For sure, especially when you think about the sheer scale of death under the Soviets.
Right.
Over 100 million people.
Staggering. And Solzhenitsyn adds to that unease by highlighting how compassion, often at the heart of utopias, can be twisted into a justification for cruelty.
It makes you think how easily good intentions can be corrupted, especially with absolute power. And this leads to another thing that struck me, the arrest. That moment when your life is suddenly upended.
Right, he says it's a complete shift in reality. The present instantly becomes the past, and the impossible becomes your terrifying reality.
Yes. And he describes it so vividly, like the knock on the door at night, the civilian witness forced to watch, the frantic packing, the search. Nothing is sacred.
Right. He even describes this scene where, during an arrest, they dump the body of a recently deceased child from its coffin just to search it. The engineer, a notion.
It's hard to read that and not feel sick.
I know. It shows the total disregard for human dignity. But the arrest is just the beginning. Then comes interrogation, and with it, the very real threat of torture.
And the use of torture wasn't random. It was systematic. Solzhenitsyn explains how authorization for torture evolved. At first, it was this broad authorization, but later, specific decrees permitted torture for certain categories of prisoners.
Like they were targeting specific groups. Exactly. Nationalists, those suspected of underground activities.
So they maintained a veneer of legality while unleashing horrific violence. And it was all designed to get information, break resistance, and force confessions.
Precisely. They wanted to control everything.
But Solzhenitsyn points out that Stalin himself never directly ordered torture, right?
Yeah, he was clever. Stalin created a climate of fear where his subordinates knew what was expected of them, even without explicit orders.
And then he downplayed the brutality with phrases like dizziness from success, which makes it even more chilling.
Absolutely. It was manipulation and plausible deniability. But what's truly disturbing is this discovery that personal confessions were the ultimate prize of interrogation.
And that's what led to increasingly brutal torture techniques.
Yeah. Solzhenitsyn goes into some really disturbing details about the specific methods. It's hard to even imagine.
It really is. And all this was happening within the prison cells themselves, overcrowded, filthy, no privacy.
That's all.
And he talks about the psychological impact of being around broken men driven to desperation by torture. He says their presence became more persuasive than any direct threat.
Right. A constant reminder of what awaited those who didn't cooperate.
Oh, it wasn't just physical torture. They were masters of psychological manipulation, too.
They preyed on exhaustion, fear, longing for connection. They knew how to break people down mentally and emotionally.
Solzhenitsyn even says interrogators took a perverse pleasure in breaking strong opponents.
Right. Finding amusement in their suffering.
It's a chilling aspect of human nature deriving pleasure from another's pain. Makes you question the very nature of evil, doesn't it?
It does. And that leads us to something else important in Solzhenitsyn's work, his exploration of the very nature of evil. He doesn't shy away from it.
He states outright that the existence of the Gulag is undeniable proof that evildoers exist in the world.
He doesn't mince words.
And he uses some really chilling anecdotes to support that, like the rumor about the Cheka in Petrograd and Odessa. You remember feeding prisoners to zoo animals during the famine?
I do. It was awful.
It seemed so horrific at first. But then he asks, in the logic of the regime, why wouldn't they?
It was expedient.
Right. And that's what makes it so disturbing. It forces us to confront the idea that even the most unimaginable acts can be normalized under certain circumstances.
And even justified in their minds.
Solzhenitsyn also says that the line the classic Shakespearean villain wouldn't cross, that line of unimaginable cruelty, well, those in power in the Soviet system, they crossed it.
Yeah, the sobering thought that those who hold power are capable of committing acts of evil that would make even criminals flinch.
So how do we grapple with that? How do we even begin to process the existence of such evil?
That's where Solzhenitsyn takes this interesting turn. He explores the ways prisoners coped with the horrors, the choices they made in the face of unimaginable suffering.
At internal struggle, right? To survive at any cost versus maintaining some moral integrity.
And he suggests that renouncing that single-minded aim of survival at any cost can actually lead to a profound transformation of character.
Like finding strength in unexpected places, even in the midst of suffering.
Exactly. He talks about genuine friendships emerging amidst the harshness. Imprisonment, for all its horrors, forced a reevaluation of past actions, of relationships.
So it stripped away all pretense and revealed who people really were at their core.
Right. You could see their true selves.
It reminds us that even in the darkest places, humanity can still shine through. But it wasn't just adults who endured the Gulag, was it? There were children, too.
A heartbreaking reality. Children imprisoned alongside their parents, orphaned by arrests. And what's disturbing is how quickly they adapted to that brutal environment.
It's like they were forced to grow up too fast, forced to accept the might makes right ethos just to survive.
Solzhenitsyn even describes this case of a 10-year-old, Zoya Lasheva, who refused to remove her cross, even under pressure.
A small act of defiance, but so powerful. It speaks to the resilience of faith, even in the face of such adversity.
Absolutely, that inner strength.
But the Gulag reached beyond the physical camps, didn't it? What about the system of exile that awaited those who were released?
Right, release didn't mean freedom. Exile was what Solzhenitsyn called a rubbish dump. They were discarded, forced to rebuild their lives in unfamiliar and often hostile environments.
Imagine trying to rebuild after years of that. The effects must have lingered. What about the psychological toll of release?
It was jarring, for sure, and reactions varied. Some found a newfound strength, a renewed appreciation for life, while others struggled to cope with the trauma and the guilt.
So even release came with its own complexities.
Absolutely. For many, the psychological wounds were deep. They suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression. Some even had physical ailments that persisted, the results of malnutrition, overwork, and torture.
It's a reminder that the trauma extended far beyond those physical boundaries. It left scars that couldn't be erased. But Solzhenitsyn didn't just document the horrors. His work is also a call to action, right? He believed acknowledging the truth was essential to prevent it from happening again.
Exactly. He was very critical of the Soviet government trying to downplay their crimes, especially while condemning similar atrocities by the Nazis. For Solzhenitsyn, truth and accountability were paramount.
And that's why his work is so important today. Those efforts to document and memorialize the victims continue. We have to make sure these stories are never forgotten.
Right. We have to remember so we can learn from the past.
And speaking of those systems, there's this term from the book that I found fascinating, the sharashka. Can you explain what that was?
Sure. A sharashka was basically like a research and development facility, but it was staffed by imprisoned scientists, engineers, and intellectuals.
So a forced labor camp, but for the mind.
In a way, yes. They had better living conditions than regular camps, but still prisoners, subject to the whims of the regime. And their work often had military applications.
So the Gulag wasn't just about brute force and physical labor. They were exploiting intellectual capital, too.
Yes, subverting human ingenuity for the purposes of the state.
It raises questions about the ethics of scientific research, the responsibility of scientists to consider the consequences of their work.
Definitely something to think about.
And that leads to another important aspect of the Gulag, the role of religion. Can you tell us more about how faith played out within the camps?
It's complex. On the one hand, religion was officially suppressed in the Soviet Union. Atheism was the ideology, and believers were persecuted.
But within the Gulag, things were a bit different, right?
There's a tension there. While officially atheistic, the regime understood the power of religion, especially in the Gulag.
So they used it as a tool of control.
In some cases, yes. Solzhenitsyn describes this group of priests imprisoned on Solovki, one of the most notorious camps. They were allowed to form a workers' commune, even given their own church.
That all sounds humane.
It was a calculated move. They presented it as tolerance, but it was a way to control the priests and create a facade of religious freedom.
What about the prisoners themselves? Did faith offer any solace or support?
For some, yes. Solzhenitsyn writes about how faith gave many prisoners hope, a reason to keep going, even in the face of despair.
So even in a system meant to crush the human spirit, faith provided a glimmer of light.
It's a reminder of the enduring power of belief.
Absolutely. But even with faith, there was still suffering. Solzhenitsyn describes how those same priests on Solovki were eventually forced to witness the execution of fellow prisoners,
Just awful.
powerless to stop it. It's a reminder that even faith can be tested in extreme circumstances. And the Gulag system was designed to break everyone, regardless of belief.
It was brutal and unforgiving.
It makes you think about the limits of faith.
It does, but it also highlights the importance of individual resistance, even in the face of overwhelming power.
And that's one of the things that makes Solzhenitsyn's work so compelling. This unflinching portrayal of the Gulag's horrors and, at the same time, the enduring strength of the human spirit.
It shows both sides.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes it so important.
People need to know this history.
Definitely. And understand what it means for us even today.
Exactly. One thing that really struck me about Solzhenitsyn's work was how he described the transport system in the Gulag. It wasn't just about moving prisoners, it was a tool of dehumanization.
Right. It was all part of the archipelago, right? These scattered camps, prisons, all linked by this invisible network.
Exactly. And the journeys themselves were brutal. Those red cattle cars packed with prisoners traveling for weeks.
With barely any food or water.
Or sanitation. It was dehumanizing, reducing them to cargo.
He describes the psychological torture, too. The uncertainty, lack of control, the fear.
Torture in itself.
And even within the camps, this constant movement. Prisoners shifted between work details, transferred, always at the mercy of the system.
A giant machine churning away at human lives.
And some individuals became complicit in its operation, right? Not just guards, but even fellow prisoners.
He calls them trustees, prisoners given authority within the camps, overseeing others.
That must have created a really complex dynamic.
Oh, absolutely. Some exploited their power, becoming brutal enforcers, but others tried to help, offer some kindness or protection.
It's a reminder that even in a system like the Gulag, human agency still existed.
Right. That capacity for both good and evil.
Solzhenitsyn doesn't shy away from that moral complexity, the compromises prisoners made to survive, those impossible choices.
It's easy to judge from the outside, but when you're facing death, how do you even begin to make those choices?
Yeah, it's a question that haunts this whole work.
Right.
And there are no easy answers.
He doesn't let anyone off the hook, though. He challenges us to think critically about the choices we make, even under pressure.
So if we're talking about moral complexity, what about the regime's use of religion? Was that a common tactic, manipulating faith?
Oh, definitely. Solzhenitsyn describes how they would sometimes allow these small pockets of religious freedom within the camps, almost like a pressure valve.
So a calculated move to maintain control while appearing tolerant.
Exactly. It shows their understanding of human psychology, how to manipulate people's beliefs and longing for comfort.
Speaking of manipulation, Solzhenitsyn talks about the Solovki camp, right? What was that like?
Solovki was originally a monastery on a remote island in the White Sea. It was turned into one of the most brutal labor camps.
A place of spiritual retreat turned into a symbol of oppression.
And he describes chilling practices there, like they forced prisoners to wash the blood off the steps leading to the execution ground.
Oh, God. So the blood wouldn't stain the stone.
Right, trying to erase the evidence.
It speaks to the goal of not just imprisonment, but erasure.
Destroying lives, memory, history.
But despite their efforts, the truth emerged.
Right.
Largely because of Solzhenitsyn's work.
Absolutely. His book is a testament to the power of individual witness, speaking truth to power.
He wasn't alone, though, was he?
No, there were countless others who risked their lives to document the horrors, share their stories.
And their efforts have had a profound impact. The Gulag is no longer a secret. It's a reminder of the dangers of totalitarian regimes.
And the importance of individual rights and freedoms.
So, what lessons can we learn from this? How can we apply them to our own lives?
Well, Solzhenitsyn says the first step is acknowledging the truth. Without that, no reconciliation, no healing.
Truth and reconciliation. It's essential.
He also emphasizes resisting the urge to dehumanize others, even our enemies.
That must be hard, especially after confronting something like the Gulag.
It is. But he says if we reduce our enemies to monsters, we risk losing sight of our own capacity for evil. We create this moral binary.
So we make it easier to justify violence.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our shared humanity.
Even with those who've committed terrible acts.
It's challenging, but important.
It is. What else did he say?
He talked about the power of memory, remembering the victims, honoring their stories.
So their suffering isn't forgotten.
Right. Keeping the flame of truth alive. He describes this incident when the writer Maxim Gorky visited Solovki. Remember him?
Yeah, celebrated voice of the people.
The prisoners were excited. They thought he'd expose the truth, be their savior.
Hope in the midst of darkness.
Tragically, he was manipulated. They showed him a fake version of the camp.
So even well-intentioned people can be deceived.
Exactly. It shows the power of propaganda, how it distorts reality.
So how do we guard against that?
Critical thinking, questioning narratives, seeking multiple perspectives, challenging assumptions.
Not taking things at face value.
Right. Solzhenitsyn's work is a powerful reminder of that. But he doesn't just leave us with despair. He talks about resistance, individual agency.
That must be hard to imagine in such an oppressive system.
It is. But Solzhenitsyn himself is an example. He could have stayed silent, but he spoke out, risking his own safety.
It's inspiring.
It is. And it reminds us that small acts of resistance can make a difference.
What were some ways they resisted within the camps?
Many ways. Sabotage, slowing work, damaging equipment, refusing orders. Others resisted through cultural preservation.
Keeping those traditions alive.
Sharing stories, singing, writing, keeping the flame of creativity alive.
Asserting their humanity.
Exactly. And some resisted through spiritual defiance, holding on to their faith.
So it could also be internal, preserving your sense of self.
Right. And there were even instances of collective resistance, like the Kengir uprising.
Right, where they took control of the camp for a while.
It showed the potential for collective action.
So even in those desperate circumstances, hope can flicker. The fight for freedom can continue.
And that's what we need to remember.
Absolutely. But what about those who survived? What happened after they were released?
That's another powerful part of Solzhenitsyn's work. The challenges of re-entering society, the psychological toll, the trauma.
It must have been so hard to adjust.
It was. Many felt alienated, marked by their experiences, and there was the constant fear of being sent back.
So the trauma didn't end with release. It continued to haunt them.
Yes. Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression. Some even had physical ailments that lingered, the result of the terrible conditions.
It's heartbreaking. But Solzhenitsyn also describes stories of resilience, of hope.
He does. He writes about how some found solace in faith, in reconnecting with loved ones, in working for justice.
So after experiencing the worst of humanity, there was still beauty, still hope.
It speaks to the enduring power of the human spirit.
It really does. But we have to remember, the Gulag wasn't just a historical event. It's a warning about unchecked power.
About the fragility of human rights and the need to be vigilant.
We can't just assume it can't happen again, can we?
No, we have to be vigilant, recognize the warning signs, and speak out.
Speaking out, that's key. It's easy to feel powerless against a system like that.
Yeah.
How did Solzhenitsyn see individuals resisting such oppression?
He was clear that resistance comes in many forms, from small acts to organized uprisings.
So it wasn't just about grand rebellions.
Not at all. He talks about sabotage in the camps, slowing work, damaging equipment, refusing orders.
Finding little ways to disrupt things.
Exactly. Asserting your agency. Others resisted through cultural preservation.
Holding on to their traditions.
Sharing stories, singing, writing poetry, keeping creativity alive.
You can imprison my body, but not my mind.
Right. And spiritual defiance, too, holding on to their faith.
And internal resistance.
Exactly. And, of course, there were cases of collective resistance, like Kengir.
Where they actually took control of the camp.
Showing the potential of collective action. It's incredible.
So even in those desperate circumstances, hope can flicker, resistance can smolder.
And the fight for freedom can continue.
These stories really show the importance of never giving up hope.
Of always seeking ways to resist injustice. And believing in a better future. You know, it's interesting how Solzhenitsyn shows that the Gulag's impact went beyond the individuals. It affected Soviet society as a whole.
Right. It wasn't just contained within those camps.
No, it created this atmosphere of suspicion everywhere. Everyone was a potential enemy, even friends and family.
Because anyone could be informing, right?
Exactly. The system turned people against each other, making it impossible to trust anyone or talk openly.
So the Gulag was about psychological control just as much as physical imprisonment.
Absolutely. And it devastated the country's intellectual and moral life. Dissent was stifled, thinking for yourself was dangerous.
It was like a self-inflicted wound, meant to protect the state, but it undermined its very foundation.
Right. Solzhenitsyn argues it was self-defeating. It created a workforce that was demoralized and unproductive, and it eroded the legitimacy of the Soviet state.
So the very system that was supposed to keep control actually contributed to its downfall.
Exactly. It's a powerful lesson about how oppression can't last.
It really is. And that's why Solzhenitsyn's work is so important. It's a warning to us. A warning about tyranny, about protecting our freedoms, about being vigilant. We can't just assume something like that can't happen here.
No, we can't. We have to be alert, recognize the warning signs, and speak out against injustice.
Speaking out is so important. It's easy to feel powerless against a system like the Gulag. Did Solzhenitsyn have any thoughts on how people could resist such overwhelming oppression?
He did, and he emphasized that resistance can take many forms. It's not just about big rebellions.
So even small acts of defiance matter.
Absolutely. He describes how prisoners resisted within the camps. Things like sabotage, slowing down work, damaging equipment.
Finding those little ways to disrupt the system.
Yes, asserting their agency. Others resisted through cultural preservation, telling stories, singing songs, writing poetry.
Keeping those traditions and that spirit alive.
Exactly. They were saying, you can imprison my body, but not my mind. And then there was spiritual defiance holding on to their faith.
So resistance can also be internal, about preserving your own beliefs, your sense of self.
Right. And of course, there were instances of collective resistance, like the Qingyur uprising.
When the prisoners took control of the camp.
It showed the potential for collective action.
So even in a place like that, hope and the fight for freedom can exist.
And that's something we should never forget.
Absolutely. What about the prisoners who survived? What happened to them afterwards?
That's another powerful part of Solzhenitsyn's work. The challenges they faced when they were released, the psychological impact.
Trauma? It must have been so difficult to adjust to life outside the camps.
It was. Many felt alienated, like they didn't belong anymore. And the fear of being sent back was always there.
So the trauma didn't just end when they were released.
No. Many had nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety. Some had physical problems because of the conditions in the camps.
It's hard to imagine what they went through. But Solzhenitsyn also talks about resilience and hope, right?
He does. He writes about how some found comfort in their faith, in reconnecting with their loved ones, in working for justice.
So even after experiencing that kind of horror, they could still find meaning and purpose.
Yes, it shows the strength of the human spirit.
It really does. But it's important to remember that the Gulag wasn't just some event in the past. It's a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting our freedoms.
We have to be vigilant and guard against those things.
Absolutely. Solzhenitsyn's work is powerful. The Gulag Archipelago is a difficult book to read, but it's also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
And the power of truth. We should never forget what happened there.
We shouldn't. And I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
As always, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic. Read the Gulag Archipelago, seek out the stories of the survivors, and reflect on what it all means for us today.
It's an important part of history.
It is, and it has lessons for us all. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.